Thank you. So just a little bit of background of where we are coming from. Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. I always like to kind of clarify that we're not part of the university, the academic system, the medical center. We are separate. We are a U.S. defense contractor. So our sponsors are the DoD, NASA, DHS, a lot of the three-letter agencies. So we get highly targeted by very sophisticated actors, nation states, advanced persistent threats, whatever you want to call them. So there is a difference between the university and what we're doing. Next slide. And a little bit about me. I've been at the lab for about almost 12 years now. I manage cyber operations. The work that we're going to be presenting here is the work that our operational cyber research team works on. And this is something that I established when I first started at the lab. And actually, I started it with Todd here.
Yeah, so I'm one of the senior detection engineers on the team and a cyber researcher. And throughout this presentation will be some of the, the fruits of our labor along the way. So today we're going to discuss a few problems, offer a few solutions, and discuss how we measure success. Alert fatigue is very real. I think it's been a theme throughout some of the other presentations as well. And it leads to a reluctance for us to craft new alerts in fear that we're going to overwhelm our responders. This fear will ultimately result in missed detections and missed investigations. So I'm going to make the argument that the solution to alert fatigue is to create more alerts, but we're going to utilize them in more meaningful ways. We'll discuss the challenges associated with the stateless nature of traditional Splunk queries and recommend some alternative approaches to data analysis using stateful approaches like Python and Pandas. We'll discuss our implementation of baseline drift and how it helps reduce the volume of actionable alerts, as well as our strategy for identifying hosts of interest based on attack complexity. So as you can see by these numbers, we're dealing with quite a bit of telemetry and an alert volume that's unmanageable. I'm sure this is, and I don't even consider us that big of an environment, so I'm sure your numbers, maybe more or less, but the point is, vendor signatures can create a great deal of noise and often continuously flag on the same thing over and over. If everything's an alert, then is anything actionable? So the traditional approach of responding to individual alerts lacks prioritization, focus, and proper assignment of severity. And when these alerts are, the volumes are no longer manageable, we need to come up with a different solution. So I mentioned earlier that alert fatigue leads to this reluctance to craft new alerts. So let's create some new alerts. If we're to look at just 2 of the 400 telemetry sources that I mentioned in the previous slide, we can have significant coverage if properly utilized. We can craft behavioral alerts that a traditional EDR may ignore. So if we look at Sysmon alone, it has visibility in upwards of 60% of all post-exploitation techniques in the MITRE Enterprise Attack Framework. Windows Event ID 4688 alone has visibility in upwards of 35%. But what we need to realize is having visibility into our telemetry is not the same as a detection, and that having a detection in place does not mean that the SOC is going to respond. So our detection capabilities rely on how well we collect and utilize our data, and our response relies on how well we represent our detections. So by now, again, themes throughout the conference, we all recognize the value of building and mapping our detections to the MITRE attack framework. So here's a few examples of the recommended detection criteria as defined by MITRE. And for this specifically, we're looking at T1059 for PowerShell. So, but if we successfully create detections and achieve, full coverage for each and every technique, do we again run the risk of failure due to alert fatigue? Because here in a single day, the recommended detection for unusual PowerShell execution has close to 800 hosts flagging on encoded command, close to 300 flagging on invoke expression, even worse, 9,000 hosts in our environment on a single day are triggering for execution bypass. We can do the same thing for scheduled tasks. Here we see close to 10,000 hosts flagging over and over again to the tune of 11 million times with 122,000 distinct command lines in a single day. So baseline drift is our approach to addressing large volumes of data and the repeated flagging on these detection criteria. We're looking to identify unique events that deviate from what is standard or expected based on historical tracking of this data. Now, how we calculate our uniqueness identifier for our various models is not unlike Salesforce's approach to calculating a JA3 hash. We're simply calculating the MD5 of some tuple of information. And for our detections to be effective, we only need to track the metadata relevant to each use case. The truth and additional context is always available back in the raw logs. So for example, if we wanted to track lateral movement using DCOM, we only need to track the first and last known timestamps, the source host and process, and the destination host and process by the uniqueness identifier that we've created. And although the uniqueness identifier criteria is different for like our name pipes detection, it uses the same exact approach. So we've had like an overwhelming success at catching things like Cobalt Strike when they're using name pipes. They can change their malleable C2, all day long, but if they're using name pipes and we have our telemetry, we should catch it. So at the bottom, we see like my host continuing to use PSExec against my VM. And while the last known timestamp changes with each detection, the underlying metadata still results in a single row of data in our database. Now, what's more interesting might be these unknown pipes occurring on April 17th, but this was just me messing around, sending some remote commands to my server. But again, each of them unique, and each of them tracked in our database. So a few slides back, I was complaining about the volume associated with the recommended detection for PowerShell's invoke expression. With our baseline drift model, we're only focusing on the unique instances of invoke expression. And here we see 0 unique results over 30 days as compared to the 2,000 results a traditional query would have yielded in a single day. So my argument is, if our 3-tuple of the parent name, process name, and command line isn't malicious the first time, it's probably not going to be malicious the 999th time that it happens. So again, using our PowerShell invoke expression as an example, we simply run our query hourly and only capture the unique instances of our detection. We do this for all techniques across the enterprise framework. If the detection does not yet exist by that uniqueness identifier, we'll create a new row. Else, we'll update the last known values for that uniqueness identifier. So now that we have all of these, the attack framework has been addressed, can we do some custom analytics as well? Having all this data stored in our database, what kinds of questions can we ask? So this is an example of various tables that are tracking beacon-like activity using a similar baseline drift approach. Here I'm simply asking our SQL database to show me host flagging on our C2 analytics where the first known date of the tracked FQDN is in the past 7 days, and the duration of that suspected beacon has lasted more than 60 minutes. That might be of interest to us at the time we're running this query. The results of this particular query on that day was that 3 of the 9 rows returned were in fact C2 channels established by sanctioned red team engagements within our environment. I believe one was Cobalt Strike, one was Sliver, and another was C2 using Microsoft dev tunnels. So throughout the years, it's become increasingly apparent that there is no single silver bullet detection that will identify a compromise. Even with our baseline drift models in place, very few of them are high fidelity and have standalone value. So having near full coverage of the MITRE attack framework and a whole bunch of custom analytics running hourly, how can we find a host of significant interest worthy of a full investigation? So benefiting from years of red team exercises, research, and a few minor breaches along the way, we've come to realize that an adversary needs to accomplish more than one tactic to achieve their objectives. The fact that malware executed does not constitute a breach. Did they move laterally? Did they elevate their privileges? Did they maintain persistence, establish C2, et cetera? If the answer is no, we can deprioritize. So we use these questions to develop an attack complexity model so that we can focus on hosts exhibiting behaviors representative of an actual attack. So, in this field, everything we do is based on the assumption that we are compromised. It's up to us on a daily basis to prove that we're not. We need to assume that a persistent threat is going to defeat our high-dollar security solutions and our appliances and eventually breach our environment. Using the SolarWinds attack as an example, we'll see this actor accomplished 49 techniques across 10 separate tactics.
Switch.
Oh, sorry. So 49 techniques across 10 separate tactics. We discussed PowerShell and scheduled tasks a few slides back, and we can continue the conversation for each and every technique. I would suspect that even though you all have WMI event consumers in your environment, the number of unique consumers and filters will tail quite nicely if an appropriate uniqueness identifier has been applied. So using 5861 Windows Event ID as our basis or our starting point, we haven't had a new row of data for this particular technique in quite some time. Now, with all due respect to APT 29, nothing on this slide as far as post-exploitation activity jumps off the page as being new or novel. Advanced actors tend to excel in resource development and initial access, but our focus is on post-exploitation activities that we have the telemetry for. And as I stated before, with very little exception, we believe an adversary will need to accomplish more than a single tactic to achieve their objectives. So again, having all of our unique detections living in our database, what other questions can we ask? So this is just a big SQL query to help us find hosts exhibiting those behaviors associated with high attack complexity over 7 days. The cyber analytics query there is simply a view into all of these baseline drift tables with mappings to tactics and techniques. We're looking for host flagging on 2 or more tactics. And again, this is just one model, and we can always adjust the criteria to suit our needs. But again, at the time this was run, 3 of the 10 hosts returned were in fact compromised by a red team exercise. And this is a kind of a 30-day scatter plot graphical representation illustrating the high volume of single tactic hosts on the left versus the lower volume of multiple tactics occurring on hosts on the right. So the 2 hosts on the far right are flagging on 4 or more tactics, multiple techniques, but 4 or more tactics. So each of those were, again, in fact, by a red team, compromised by a red team. And about 7% of these 1,800 hosts over this 30-day time frame were of elevated interest to our SOC. But again, these 2 hosts just kind of jumped off the page. So, this is our focus and our approach. By grouping these alerts together, we can focus on the low volume, high complexity hosts where we see hosts triggering few times, but across multiple tactics and techniques, versus that alert fatigue of the high volume, low complexity host where we see hosts triggering multiple times repeatedly on the same technique over and over again. So one strategy might be if hosts triggering are 2 or more tactics, we may choose to elevate and prioritize that investigation. Whereas hosts with only execution alerts, we're going to deprioritize them unless they become repetitive or additional behaviors present themselves. If they're repetitive and benign, we can go back to our initial detection criteria and adjust as needed. So here are some numbers that differ, quite a bit from the original problem statement I presented earlier. One of our baseline drift models has been tracking all PowerShell outbound connections since April of 2021. And to date, we've only had just over 3,000 unique connections. For that, I'm using a uniqueness identifier. I'm taking the MD5 of the process path, the FQDN, and the remote port. And we track unique connections for every single process that makes an outbound connection. Applying baseline drift to our EDR has resulted in an alert reduction of over 99%. And prior to this approach, again, back to that previous slide, the EDR was averaging about 6,000 alerts per day, and sometimes we were seeing surges of about 18,000 alerts per day. Our baseline drift table for the EDR only has 1,900 rows in it to date. And the SQL database tracking all of these analytics, all of these baseline drift models for each tactic and technique is only 3 gigabytes so far, and has a retention time far greater than our Splunk environment. And perhaps the best part is, on average, only a little bit of maybe 2% of all hosts in our environment that are generating alerts make it to our big board of things to prioritize and investigate. And so despite the large number of hosts, telemetry, and alert volume, we're actively investigating just those few hosts per day. And this frees up time for hunting and additional data analytics. And Anthony's now going to share some insights into our approach to iterative data analysis outside of Splunk, S3, and other log aggregators.
Yeah, so the idea of this talk was really, and thanks, Todd, for illustrating how we're using things outside of our SIEM databases. So I'm going to talk about doing some things that I felt bound by using a traditional SIEM. As Todd mentioned, we don't believe in silver bullet queries, and that's what it seemed like we were doing, is building these bigger and bigger and bigger queries. Yeah, I just felt very, it didn't feel like I was doing data analysis. I felt like I was being kind of shoehorned into a specific way of what I could do based on the limitations of the SIEM itself, right? So I couldn't do X, Y, and Z because the SIEM didn't support that. Whereas, so say stateless queries, one of the reasons we build these massive queries sometimes and join a bunch of tables is because once we have the data, that's the data you have, right? You can't then do further analysis on that data, and that's where kind of this idea of stateless queries. You can join some data, but you're kind of limited. You can't take the results of a query and put it into a variable and pass that variable to, another query, which I'm going to show you guys kind of how I'm doing some of that, So if it's not SIEMs, then what is it, And for us, it's been Python and pandas and, the idea that I can run a Python query against a set of data, and then I get the results back, and then the results become represented by a variable that I can pass into another query that I loop in batches because maybe it's too many results. So we end up with what I call, these Venn diagrams of different sets of analysis. And that center piece there isn't really correlation, and I'm going to show you why it's not correlation with some actual code. But it gives you more flexibility in doing what I call iterative analysis, where you take one set of data and you just keep on pivoting from that set of data. We'll go through some examples. Now, the other thing about this methodology is when we're working in Jupyter Notebooks or VS Code, you can share that with other people. So if you got kind of a hunt routine down, it's easy to share that with the team. So for this example, and I do want to highlight, guys, this isn't a detection. It's an example about a process and how you can apply this in maybe your own environment. So Todd's got these databases. There at the top, I'm just going to pull down, some data. Looks like we got 31,000 plus rows of data. More than I would normally, be able to do anything with. but we're going to focus on the destination host, which is that FQDN, in this data of kind of interesting web traffic, let's call it that. And so what we can do, and exactly what I was mentioning earlier, we're going to take those FQDNs, those des hosts, and pass it to this variable on the top left there, FQDN list. And the nice thing we can do about that is pull that, put that into a query, and we're going to query another database. Now, you may ask, that's 31,000 rows you're just passing to the database. If you wanted to, right here, you could create a for loop. You could do this in batches. But essentially what we want to do is this secondary database that we have is keeping track of websites that people are of FQDNs. You know, the first scene, Todd talked about the first scene and the last scene, so we're tracking that on every domain in our environment. And then if it's matching, you know, we're going to give it a binary 1. If it doesn't, it's a 0. And the idea here is, hey, maybe there's some website, you know, update.microsoft.com. We've got, you know, 50 hits in the last month. We know about it. It's phishing. Okay, not a big deal. There's some other domain, example 2 there at the top right. That's a known legitimate business partner. And then we have the last one there. And that we haven't seen before. It's some, you know, relatively new. You know, these are like subjective decisions that we're kind of making based on our knowledge of our infrastructure, but it has some degree of uniqueness and newness in our environment, so we're going to track that, and that's kind of the thread here. So if I filter down and just look at the ones that match for, say, the last 4 days, that's what the query parameters on the database was. We go down from 31,000, you know, to like, I think we're at 79 rows there. So that's a significant reduction. But I have hosts and I have FQDN. I talked a little bit earlier about that kind of overlap of Venn diagrams. Wasn't correlation, and this is kind of how it's not, because we're going to use more Python to actually do a pivot. So we have the host name, but we want to pivot to identity data. We want to look for anomalies in identity, and workstation name is not in our identity logs. What we want is let's say our identity logs are identified by our email. So what I can do is, again, you know, take the host name, pass it to a variable. It's now in host name. Look at our 4624s. Our 4624s have our hosts, and it has the users, you know, whatever your source is, whether it is a SIEM, whether it's in a database. Query your 4624s, get aggregate values, get a list of all your users. So now you have all your users. We're going to pivot again. So now you take your users, you do an LDAP query. Kind of going to step through this. You do an LDAP query, you pass your unique values to your function. You know, the function does the LDAP query itself, and then you have your results that you write to another data frame, and now you have all your email addresses. Do that in a SIEM. Sorry. But these are the types of things that are in my head that I get frustrated with when I work in SIEMs, because I can't do all these steps that I want to do. But now that I have emails, I can query my identity data. I can pass the emails into another variable and query against my logs. And at the bottom left here is just a sample of identity logs. So from here, it gets a little interesting, because I look at all my fields in my identity logs, and I identify 3 fields I think are interesting. What app is being authenticated against, the outcome, fail, allow, success, the actual event type. And I wonder if those combinations, if we could identify an anomaly in those combinations. So again, a little bit of Python, and we have a new feature. We've actually done some feature engineering. So I now have a column that has the app, the outcome, and the event type. So why did I do that? Why didn't I just create features from the individual Dropbox, Slack, Salesforce, log in, log off? The reason is because of context, and it'll make a little more sense on the next slide. But if I have this row of data here, I have success and I have failure in the top row, and I don't know if that success is associated with Dropbox or it's associated with Salesforce. I don't know if that failure is associated with log in or log off. So if I use Python to create a new feature, that triplet, now I know that the context is Dropbox login success, Slack login failure, and those become features. So the next thing that we do here is a little interesting, a little different take, and again, maybe we're thinking outside of the box a little bit, but I want to go back 90 days, but I don't want to evaluate the entire 90 days worth of data. This is something that I call time slices. So I want to take those triplets and I want to look at time slices in 3-day increments at a time. And I'm going to overlap those with 48-hour overlaps and increment those in 1-day periods, okay? So it'd be May 1st through 3rd, and 2nd through 4th, and 3rd through 5th. Again, these are subjective decisions. We're experimenting, we're exploring, right? It could be 7 days. What's your use case? Are you looking for something that you think might happen over a 7-day period of time? My focus here was I was looking for activity that was happening over a smaller period of time, and I didn't want data from 3 months ago to impact or influence the data analysis that I was doing. So I end up with these triplets. I end up with these time slices. There's just like 9 lines of Python code. And when I talk to people, there's this fear that they have to learn programming to do this. And I've shown very little Python code in these examples. And it's pretty straightforward. I don't have a Python background. And, a few years ago, I started applying myself in this way. And here I am. So the next thing is, now we're getting into we need to prep the data for machine learning, okay? So all of those various triplets all have unique values. And there's a library within scikit-learn called multi-label binarizer. And if you apply that, you'll see in the data frame there, we take the triplet column there, and it actually turns all those different values in that column into features. So now we have I think it's 125 different columns for every possible variant of the triplet. So now we're ready for machine learning. So what did we do? We started with the database query. We filtered it down. We cross-referenced another database. And then we took the host name and used 4624s for all the account logins. Then we pivoted to LDAP, and then we grabbed all the emails, and then we pivoted again and used those emails to query identity data. And from the identity data, we did some feature engineerings and some time slices, and we prepped for machine learning. And here's where we're going to stop, and I do want to plug my talk that I have in tomorrow that's going to get into more of data science and machine learning, and we're going to do some clustering, and we're going to do some local outlier factor. We're going to do some statistical modeling of some of the data, but from this flow, again, this is more of a process than it was of of a single detection. At any point here, you could have took a different avenue. So, yeah. So to end, how do we measure success? We do a lot of red teaming. Our goal is to fail, really. I mean, there's a lot of, so I go to my CIO and I don't, without any hesitation, to let him know how we failed, because that's the only way we're going to fill gaps. It's the only way that we're going to learn. We do things like seeded access, assume compromise, assume breach. I don't give KPI reports. It's really about identifying gaps in our systems and filling those gaps in capabilities, processes, and skills. With that, I'll end there. And
Thank you. Thank you, both of you.